evening, folks. Good evening, folks. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I hadn't been back to Philadelphia since 1980. But there is a substantial, I don't know how substantial it is, but there's a group of Lumbees who live in the Frankfurt area. And back in the 70s, I was still in college, like many of you, and I would come up and hang out with the Lumbees who lived in Philadelphia. And we're going to go tomorrow and try to find that community and see if I can't reminisce with a few Lumbees from back home. So I'm really happy to be up. But I had never been to Villanova in all my times up here. But it's a beautiful campus, and really am happy and honored to be here with my lovely wife, Shelley. And it's auspicious in a way because what happened today at the Supreme Court, right? New justice, right? Ketanji Brown Jackson, 53 to 47, nip and tuck all the way, right? But I'm really glad that she's on the court. And her being there now, along with Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of Interior, the first Indigenous cabinet appointee in the United States history. So that ties in well with what I'm going to be talking about tonight, the ways in which Indigenous peoples and African American peoples share similar and yet quite different political and legal space in this country. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, Paul. Your work has been invaluable to me too. I use it a lot in my own teaching, in my own research, and I really have learned a lot from your work. And I want to thank Jim and Judy Birle for providing the endowed chair that has helped you to continue your good work. And thank you all. How many of you are students? Most of you. That's great. That's great. I can't get students to come to my own class, much less come to a lecture. So thank you for coming out on this rainy evening. So I'm going to get through this talk and share it with you, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And I talked to a number of you in the classes today. I recognize you from this afternoon's session. So I'm looking forward to sharing this research with you. I know one of the good questions I got from a student in the class today was about land acknowledgements. And they become ubiquitous across Indian country, where natives and non-natives who are visiting a particular country will acknowledge the indigenous peoples whose lands the institution is now situated upon. And I think that's very appropriate. But as I told the students today, at the same time we do that, we should also be having a labor acknowledgement for all the African Americans who were the enslaved peoples who built many of those institutions, right? So we need to do both a land acknowledgement and a labor acknowledgement for both of these important ethnic groups because of their shared history of oppression and enslavement and the ongoing discrimination that they each experience in American society. So I just wanted to share that with you. So it's nice to be here, even though Villanova lost in the semifinal and my boys lost in the final. I was brokenhearted about Carolina's defeat. I bleed Carolina blue, so it was hard. And yet we beat Duke twice. So that made it a successful year in my book. So I'm really happy about that. As Paul said, I'm a citizen of the Lumbee Nation of North Carolina. We're the largest tribe east of the Mississippi. We've got about 66,000 citizens in our nation. That makes us the fifth or sixth largest indigenous group in the country. My home county is Robeson County. It's the largest county in the state of North Carolina. And it has historically been a triracial county, about a third African American, a third Lumbee, and a third white. Although increasingly over the last 10, 15 years, a number of Latinos have moved in, so it's almost now divided into four parts. And while there have always been bonds of kinship and political solidarity between African Americans and natives in my home region, these relationships existed within a racial hierarchy, with natives occupying a gray area hovering between the black and the white. The blacks were on the lowest end of the social and economic spectrum. Lumbees were situated in the middle. Whites, of course, occupied the dominant position. While we all know that the Jim Crow South had two separate facilities for blacks and whites, water fountains, building entrances, movie theater seating, and the like, Robeson County had three, as Lumbees who insisted they belonged to neither of the other groups caused a great deal of consternation by intermingling in whichever area they chose at any given time. My dad tells me about when he would go to Lumberton, which was the county seat, he had to use the Indian water fountain because he wouldn't use the black fountain, and he certainly wasn't allowed to use the white fountain. But we had our own water fountains, our own seating and movie theaters, and so on. So it was a unique triracial situation that existed for a long time. Robeson County isn't really that unique once you consider the founding of the U.S. and the creation of the states. The relations between Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, and Native peoples dominated early social, economic, and cultural dynamics across the country. This legacy can be seen clearly from a constitutional perspective, as tribal nations and African-Americans possess a unique, often ambiguous, and in the case of blacks, a racist constitutional status, right? 3/5 of a person, right? Not even whole, 3/5. As someone who has studied indigenous peoples' rights nationally, I thought it appropriate to give a comparative talk, examining the ways African Americans and indigenous nations are akin and at the same time apart. It's critical that we understand these histories as our communities assert their rights in relation to the United States, whether it be through common struggles over voting rights and access to justice, or distinct but parallel movements like those for reparations or treaty rights claims and the exercise of civil rights. The United States has always put forth contradictory and convoluted positions regarding our respective rights and statuses. It has used this ambiguity to pit us against one another, fighting over economic crumbs. Our communities have sometimes fallen into this trap, and we see the dangers of history repeating itself today. I think particularly of the emerging confusion over black reparations versus indigenous land claims. If we don't make the time to understand and respect our differences and similarities, our combined strengths and our hopes lie right here, right now. We are all well aware that entrenched structural racism continues unabated. African Americans have fought hard and have made some gains, but it often seems that as soon as progress is made in one area, it's undermined or stripped away in another area. A country whose very existence is predicated on the labor of the enslaved will not rebuild this system willingly. Similarly, for Native peoples, our situation also remains tenuous. We simply lack demographic, economic, and political clout. Our political and legal status confuses many people. We even have trouble explaining it to ourselves sometimes. For many Americans, we are basically considered conquered nations. Or in the case of Southern Indians, we never existed at all, or we don't exist now. And there are some Western Native folk who don't believe that there are bona fide Native people still living in the East. They think we were all disappeared, but that's not true. If you're one of those individuals who question the political and cultural status of the Eastern Natives, that's thanks in large part to Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, a man named Walter Plecker. He was an avowed racist, and commencing in 1914, Plecker spent his entire 32-year career erasing any mention of natives in Virginia in all state records. He destroyed existing historical documents and made sure that no birth or death certificates were issued with the word Indian on them. You were either black or you were white. Indigenous did not exist in his worldview. Plains people talk about Custer. Virginia Indians talk about Plecker as their destroyer of their legal and political identity. Rather than a rifle and bayonet, he wielded a fountain pen that severed the bloodlines, the kinship, and history of 11 nations in that state. And they're still recovering from what he caused, the damage that he did to their communities throughout the middle part of the 20th century. With all that said, let me begin by examining some of the ways African Americans and Aboriginal people's life experiences in the U.S. political and legal systems parallel one another. And then in the second half of my talk, I'll talk about the differences that continue to exist. I think you'll find this an interesting assessment. Beginning with the similarities. The colonizers of what is now the U.S., reliant as they were upon the land and labor taken from others, struggled with the thorny question of our humanity, right? Were blacks human beings? Were native peoples human beings? Were they fully human? This intense philosophical and religious problem was debated deeply by church officials, lawmakers, and legal minds. Were these heathens actually human beings and as such entitled to human rights protections or constitutional protections? Or were they in fact lesser creatures, more akin to animals, thus created by God to exist in a perpetual state of inferiority? Vine Deloria said it most pithily in his book, his best-selling book, Custer Died for Your Sins. He said African Americans were perceived as draft animals. Indigenous peoples were perceived as wild animals, right? And I think that's pretty darn accurate. Nearly a century after the founding of the United States, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution finally accorded African Americans a measure of legal recognition of their humanity and constitutional personhood. But it wasn't until a federal court decision in 1879, Standing Bear versus Crook, that natives were constitutionally recognized as legal persons. Right? 1879, a court finally said natives are human beings. Right? A second important similarity is that of the inherent contradictions in the U.S. Constitution that affects and impacts both groups. On the one hand, the slave trade was banned in 1808, yet slavery remained legal in much of the country until the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Similarly, native nations, because of our treaty-based relationship with the U.S. and pre-existing status as de facto and de jure sovereign nations, were dealt with as national governing bodies. Yet, Congress, emboldened by the federal courts, has also asserted a virtually absolute or plenary power over native nations, our land, and our resources, beginning in 1886. So the federal government since 1886 has been told by the Supreme Court repeatedly that the federal government's power will always trump indigenous power if they come into contact with one another. Right? And that is still a reality that we face in this country. Thus, we can see that the original statuses of Africans and African Americans and native nations under U.S. law were viewed as extra-constitutional in nature. As slaves, African Americans were considered legally inferior to whites and were denied basic human and constitutional rights and privileges. As politically foreign nations, though domestically situated indigenous nations were viewed as extra-constitutional entities as well. We were not parties to the United States Constitution's development, and that document was largely irrelevant and inapplicable to native nations and their internal affairs, as it still is to this day. The U.S. Constitution does not apply in Indian country the same way it does here in Philadelphia or on Villanova's campus, because we are not constitutional creatures in the same sense that you are. A third similarity is also evident. John T. Noonan Jr., in a wonderful book called Persons and Masks of the Law, discussed the place of persons in the law. His thesis was that people involved in cases in the American legal tradition were often given masks, right, which concealed their true character. These masks were legal constructs, said Noonan, which suppressed the humanity of a participant in the process. Noonan's book focused largely on African Americans and the institution of slavery. The humanity of blacks was masked in American law by descriptions normally reserved for types of property, right? Once legally classified as property, people could be bartered, they could be sold, they could be murdered with no question about their human rights, right? Or their civil liberties having been violated because they were property. They were not viewed as human beings. Federal Indian policy and law was and continues to be marked by a number of masks as well, which continue to deny our humanity. Tribal nations have been defined by the Supreme Court variously as dependent peoples in a perpetual state of wardship and as discovered and conquered peoples. These masks mean that our proprietary and sovereign rights were explicitly and categorically reduced vis-a-vis the discovering conqueror, that is the United States, right? Having stepped into the shoes of Great Britain, right, who it defeated in the Revolution. There is also the mask that the United States has plenary red absolute power over native nations and their resources. And therefore, Congress was justified in imposing Christianity on natives, in kidnapping our children and shipping them away to distant boarding schools. The original one here in Pennsylvania somewhere, right? Where is Carlisle, by the way? I'm curious. Up there. Okay. I got to go see that one of these days, right? And allotting tribal lands without native consent and in direct violation of treaties. Contemporary legal masks include the notion that native nations, by having been geographically incorporated into the body politic of the United States, have somehow been implicitly divested of our inherent powers, right? And yet who incorporated whom geographically? We incorporated everybody who came here, right? So if they understand that logically, we should be the ones in control, right? But it doesn't work that way according to the Supreme Court. A fourth parallel in the historic experiences of African Americans and indigenous peoples centers on the fact that at sporadic and intermittent moments in American history, certain segments of white society have sought to forcibly assimilate African Americans and native peoples. And I say sporadic and intermittent because the overall goal of the American state and society until Brown versus Board of Education in '54 was generally to deny African Americans admittance to the American social contract, right? While indigenous peoples faced concentrated, intensive pressure to be forcibly drawn into the American social contract, though on an inferior level, right? Very different experiences there. Still, despite the wide variation in this sphere, at times there has been a thrust to assimilate the members of both groups. The federal government conducted for a brief period in the late 1800s to the early 1900s at Hampton Normal School in Virginia, right, down there at the coast, an industrial boarding school established in 1868 to provide education for the children of freed slaves. A social experiment that aimed simultaneously to, quote, enlighten and elevate the status of Black and Native children. Hampton's founder, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, believed that indigenous and African American children, quote, must be understood as races that occupied various rungs on a social Darwinist scale of civilization. Though I'm told by colleagues who specialize in Native education that even during the height of this biracial experiment, African American children were kept segregated from Native children, right? So even when they're trying to assimilate us, they still keep us bottled up in our own spheres. Another similarity in historical experience focuses on the subject of voting rights that Native people and African Americans have sought to exercise but have often been denied. And that process is ongoing, isn't it, right now, right? With 38 states having passed laws to deny or diminish the voting power of people of color. The ramped up efforts by Republican-led states to deny or diminish the voting power of African Americans through a variety of allegedly legal maneuvers, gerrymandering, limited access, electoral purges of voters, are reminders to African Americans of the tenuousness of their voting rights. And a slew of voting rights cases in North and South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, Montana, Wyoming, and other states are reminders that Native individuals are still openly discriminated against when they try to exercise the franchise. So again, we share that in common with our African American brothers and sisters. Like the struggle of virtually all communities of color, members who have sought to exercise the franchise once citizenship had been attained, African Americans and Native individuals have faced a myriad of ideological, institutional, financial, literacy, legal, and structural constraints that have either denied or diluted their voting power. And we've seen that surge up dramatically in just the last handful of years. So we're back to square one in some fundamental sense in terms of the franchise. In constitutional theory, African Americans secure the right to vote because of the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. although many were subsequently denied voting privileges until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? And to this day, Native individuals secured the right to vote in a general way in 1924, although a number of Indians had already secured it prior to that time. Although a number of states, including Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, continued to deny the vote to Indians living in those states until the early 1960s. So that's another reality that, in fact, that we share with our African American relatives. Another parallel in experiences, in 1954, the same year that Brown was handed down, Congress passed the first termination law, which we talked a little bit about today, that abruptly ended the federal government's trust relationship to the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin. This was a measure aimed at the Menominees' incorporation and integration into American society. Ironically, the termination policy that the federal government instituted among Native peoples was euphemistically called the Indians' Emancipation Proclamation, right? We were going to be freed from federal bureaucratic oppression, right? And yet it didn't work out that way. As Paul's research and the research of other folks who've studied terminated tribes bears out. Since it theoretically was going to free tribal nations, they encumbered citizens from the oppressive bureaucratic yoke of federal paternalism and domination. One final parallel would suffice. The U.S. Congress, the executive branch, and the Supreme Court issued several laws, policies, and rulings in the 1960s and 1970s that extended a measure of equal rights and opportunities to African Americans in confronting segregation, interracial marriage, busing, employment discrimination, affirmative action, and voting. Despite these important changes, large numbers of African Americans still find that they face housing and employment discrimination, poverty, criminal justice issues like George Floyd experienced in Minnesota a couple years ago, resegregation in schooling and housing, racial profiling, etc., that continue to fundamentally limit their rights to life, liberty, and the enjoyment of justice. Similarly, Native nation citizens have at times been coerced to assimilate into the American mainstream, but in order to do so, they have discovered that they were required to sacrifice additional lands, natural resources, and treaty and civil rights in order to acquire what has amounted to a second-class citizenship in many parts of the country because of ongoing legal constraints, persistent discrimination, and congressional and judicial attacks on their treaties and other rights. During the termination era of the 50s and 60s, thousands were relocated to urban areas, forced to leave their homelands, and many of them encountered the same obstacles facing urban African Americans at the time. This disconnect is part of the legacy carried by many urban Indians to this day. So all the above are potent parallels in the historical experiences of African Americans and indigenous peoples. But history, law, politics, and culture inform us that there are significant and ongoing substantive differences that I want to now turn to. The first and most obvious is that Native peoples are indigenous, right? We are the original peoples of this land. This inherent pre-existing nationhood of tribal entities became the foundation for the distinctive sovereign-to-sovereign relationships that still defines diplomatic relations between Native nations and the federal government. As we all know, prior to colonization, Native nations had existed for millennia as organized peoples inhabiting bounded homelands with appropriate economic systems and cultural and governing infrastructures. Thus, indigenous peoples are both pre-constitutional nations that continue to function as extra-constitutional nations because we have never been fully incorporated via constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution, unlike the Native nations on the Canadian side of the border. Second, indigenous peoples' national status necessitated the practice of international diplomacy, resulting in hundreds of treaties, political compacts, accords, and alliances, first with one another, then with the various competing European states, and later the United States, including Native Hawaiians, who signed accords with at least 8 foreign nations from Europe, and with the United States as well. Such diplomatic engagement was unique. No other racial, resident, or ethnic group had the national status required for this kind of diplomatic activity. The products of that process, the actual treaties, agreements, and negotiated settlements, confirmed a fundamentally political, not racial, relationship based on diplomacy, even when the diplomatic partners were not always of equal power. Okay? A large number, over 370 of these documents, form the ongoing foundation, the bedrock of the political relationship between Native nations and the federal government. They're still legally valid, even though their enforceability by the federal courts and Congress has been spotty throughout history, as we talked about in the class this afternoon. Since 1778, when the first treaty was ratified by the Delaware Nation, just south of here with the federal government, right? That treaty was immediately, almost soon thereafter, disavowed by the federal government. The Delaware people were relocated to Oklahoma, where they still live to this day. Many of these treaties involved vast land cessions by Native nations. 98% of our territory was surrendered to the federal government, mostly via treaties and agreements. As treaty-recognized sovereigns, indigenous rights are not based on or generally subject to the U.S. Constitution. This means that tribal nations are not protected by that document because as pre-existing sovereigns, they do not derive their inherent governmental powers from the federal or state governments. As Justice Clarence Thomas once said in an important case, Clarence Thomas is no friend of Native nations, believe me, and yet in this one case, he made a number of statements that were true, and one of which is this, when he said in 2004, the tribes, by contrast to the states, are not part of this constitutional order, and their sovereignty is not guaranteed by it. All right? That's an important and very powerful statement. That the U.S. Constitution, since our rights didn't flow from that document, they are also and have not been largely protected by that document. What other group can share that history? Right? No other group. Right? A third difference is the relevance and meaning of the trust doctrine. While the federal government and tribal nations have rarely agreed on a definition, President Biden in January of 2021 identified it as, quote, the crucial element in the federal government's relationship to Native nations, linking it with respect for tribal sovereignty, support of self-governance, and a commitment to fulfilling federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations. Biden has been, hands down, far superior to Donald Trump in terms of the policies that he's put into place thus far, recognizing inherent rights of tribes, reviving the nation-to-nation meetings in Washington, D.C. that President Obama started, and a number of key appointments as well, including that of Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary. But in this statement, Biden sought to assure Native nations that the federal government recognized that they have a sovereign governmental status, which the federal government, as a separate though connected sovereign, was legally and morally bound to respect under its own law. The hundreds of treaties and agreements that were negotiated in which Native peoples were guaranteed and reserved to themselves all the rights and resources not specifically ceded away were covenantal and contractual rights that were also protected by the trust doctrine, which constitutes the United States' legal and moral pledge to respect those key rights. In effect, the U.S. has long maintained, though is only spottily upheld, that it has a protectorate obligation to support indigenous peoples legally, culturally, economically, and politically. And it's best characterized by the phrase, the federal government is a trustee, and we, the indigenous peoples, are the beneficiary. Not the federal government is a guardian, and we are the ward. That was a relationship never defined by Congress or by treaty, but it just became a mindset that the Bureau of Indian Affairs adopted in the 1860s, and I still see it laid out in articles that I read, right? Very frustrating that. As Vine Delory once put it, the trust responsibility of the federal government toward the Indian tribes is mandated by the fact that Indians are extra-constitutional. No constitutional protections exist for Indians in either a tribal or an individual sense, and hence the need for special rules and regulations, special administrative discretionary authority, and special exemptions. This special body of law replaces the constitutional protections granted to other members of American society. That's why the trust doctrine is so important. And when the federal government fails to fulfill that or uphold that, we are bereft of rights. And it leaves us terribly vulnerable to machinations by the states, by the corporate world, or by the federal government. A fourth concept, the fourth difference, is a term I mentioned a little while ago, congressional plenary power. The most problematic of all the terms under discussion, and it emphatically distinguishes tribal nations from African Americans and everyone else in American society. Basically, in its broadest common sense use, plenary means entire, unqualified, absolute. In the fields of federal Indian policy and law, however, it has developed several specific meanings, but the most damning meaning simply holds that the federal government has virtually unlimited power to do whatever it deems is in our best interests or in their best interests, right? And tribes have no way to counter that when the federal government decides to invoke plenary power. And that's been most frustrating. When I teach my students about democracy, what is democracy? It's limited power, right? It's limited government, right? And yet, with the doctrine of plenary power, the federal government can do virtually whatever it wants to do, and it's answerable to no one, right? And the Supreme Court defers to Congress because of the political question doctrine. And so, again, that leaves us in a very tenuous political status. While this type of control has been overtly and violently exercised over African Americans, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution provided at least a measure of constitutional recognition and a measure of protection for their inherent rights. And since the Brown decision, some hard-fought progress has been made, but there have never been any constitutional amendments regarding Native people's rights. And despite the treaties, or one might say because of the treaties, Indigenous rights may be quashed or dramatically diminished or reaffirmed at any time if the federal government chooses to invoke its self-proclaimed plenary power. So we've all learned finally that the infamous Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of 1857, a case which Congress denied Congress the power to prohibit slavery, and that held that slaves and even black individuals were not entitled to federal citizenship and had no standing to sue in federal court. And to arrive at this decision, at this conclusion, Chief Justice Roger Taney manipulated the status of blacks in comparison to Indians in a way that reduced African American rights, but in dicta affirmed tribal sovereignty, strangely enough. His description of inherent sovereignty and treaty rights was as strong an affirmation of tribal sovereignty as had ever been written. In reading it, one could be fooled into thinking that he was a staunch supporter of native sovereignty. Yet it was in direct contradiction to his other rulings dealing directly with tribes, where he made it plain when it counted that he was not an advocate of native rights or native treaties. In Dred Scott, he was simply using this view of native status as a foil to justify the continuation and expansion of the subjugation of African Americans. This is one of many examples throughout our shared history where our communities have been pitted against one another by the justices. And in the fateful year 1896, two separate, unrelated Supreme Court decisions were handed down on the same day that provide a snapshot of the divergent statuses of the two peoples. The Supreme Court, in issuing Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which established a separate but equal doctrine and sanctioned Jim Crow laws, the court on the same day, by an identical majority, 8-1, with Harlan dissenting in both, held in Towton versus Mays, a case involving Cherokee, one Cherokee having murdered another, that the U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment did not apply to indigenous nations because their sovereignty existed prior to the Constitution and was dependent upon the will of the Cherokee people and not the will of the American public. Towton recognized and affirmed the ongoing political sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation, while Plessy dramatically trampled the civil rights, human rights of African Americans. And so you can see examples like this throughout the course of history. So in conclusion, Today, while African Americans and Native peoples have made significant strides in virtually all spheres, it is still apparent that the rights of the citizens of these two distinguished ethnic groups, even when they have been constitutionally entrenched via amendments like the 13th, 14th, and 15th, or are explicitly or implicitly embedded in ratified treaties and the property, commerce, and supremacy constitutional clauses, are nevertheless still frequently subject to vacillating interpretation, spotty implementation, and unequal enforcement. With the solidarity shown throughout through recent movements such as the Black Lives Matter originating in Minneapolis, the Land Back movement in which indigenous peoples around the country are pushing back and trying to reassert their title to lands, and defenses against environmental racism, there is hope, there is trust that together we can overcome the divide and conquer efforts that have been utilized by federal and state lawmakers since the birth of the Republic. It will take trust and education, support for reparations for African Americans, and support for indigenous claims based on treaties. These are different but parallel issues, and it's critical that we are clear in our definitions, history, and support. Otherwise, this could become another convoluted way to divide and conquer our communities. Only by taking the time to respect the differences will we be able to reap the rewards of common purpose. Only time will tell if we can ever get things right. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, reactions? Come on, Villanova. Yes.
First and foremost, thank you very much for the talk. I'm a graduate here in the graduate student in the history program. How do you view the recent appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson changing the paradigm of the ineptitude of the Supreme Court in relations to Indigenous Native Americans as well as African Americans in this country?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's too early to say because I've been looking at the legal literature and I haven't been able to find where she has established much of a track record in terms of federal Indian law. Do you know of any cases that she has? I don't think she's written much, but I have seen where she has given a statement in which she says she supports tribal sovereignty. And I believe that fundamentally. I think her and Sotomayor are going to be very strong advocates. Elena Kagan is sort of like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. She was sometimes supportive and sometimes she was dead set against Native rights. But Sotomayor has thus far been a very strong advocate for Native rights, and I feel very strongly, I hope very strongly, that Supreme Court Justice Brown will share that same empathy and support for treaty rights. I think that's going to be the case. I certainly hope it is. I mean, it doesn't change the balance of the court, right? 6-3 is what it is. But I think she's going to be a stronger voice than Breyer was on Native rights and on treaty rights. Yeah.
On that point, do you think McGirt was a preview of the court's views?
I think so. I mean, Gorsuch is the wild card here, right? I mean, he's a hard conservative, and yet he's rendered 3 important decisions that affirm treaty rights emphatically, right? And this is where his reading of the Constitution and the reading of treaties, that strict constructionist view that he has, works in our advantage, to our advantage. Unlike Scalia, unlike Thomas, right? Unlike Alito, who rarely give Native peoples the benefit of the doubt or rarely read treaties in a way that supports indigenous interpretations, Gorsuch does. And he did that in quite strong language in the McGirt decision. And when they were able to, when the Oklahoma governor tried to force the court to take it on to overturn it, the court pushed back against that. So I'm very confident. So it's going to force the governor of Oklahoma, who happens to be an enrolled member of a tribe, right, who is dead set against Native rights and Native sovereignty and Native treaties. It's going to force the state to begin to negotiate again, hopefully in good faith with the tribal nations, and find a way to deal with the jurisdictional situation. It's not the quagmire that the governor claims it was. It didn't do any of that. They just tried to paint a dark picture to get the court to jettison the case. And fortunately, to my great joy, the court said, no, we're not going to overturn that. I think as long as Gorsuch maintains his view of treaties and giving Native peoples the benefit of the doubt when there are ambiguous phrases in treaties, that holds us in good stead. I mean, Roberts, of course, is going to do what he does. So even with Gorsuch, that only gives us that fourth vote on treaty rights. But it's better than not having him there, right? And McGirt was huge. I don't know of anybody that anticipated we were going to win that case. And so when it came down 5-4, and I read his opinion, I said, my goodness, that was all right, I let out a bit of a war whoop when I read that case. I was quite happy with that. Yeah. Yes.
That's a good question. Oh, wait. I was just thinking about McGirt now, and I forgot my question. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. It'll come back to you.
Yeah. Laws. I teach a course on genocide, and I'm no longer ambivalent about what happened in this country. I define it as a genocide. I teach it as a genocide, but I also teach it as the only 100% legal genocide. In that, everything that was done in this country was done in the cover of law.
Right. That's exactly right.
Which means, and Tocqueville noticed this even.
Exactly.
And this is a land that he admires us for the efficiency of our laws to eliminate these indigenous people.
That's true.
Crazy. But I'm just wondering, if in your opinion, we got into this mess through being a land of laws, and there's reasons why we did that. Is that our way out?
See, that's the thing, the rule of law. I mean, Petra Shattuck and Jill Norgan wrote a wonderful book, came out in the early 90s, called Partial Justice. And they said the rule of law has been both the greatest shield for Native peoples and at the same time the greatest weapon against Native rights, right? It all depends on who's wielding it, right? And so when Sotomayor is wielding the law, it tends to work out in favor of Native rights. When Justice Alito is wielding the rule of law and he has the gavel, it works out against us. And so we're talking about that in Paul's class today, the inconstancy, the uncertainty, the ambiguity of how the law is used and manipulated by the federal government, by the courts. And so it makes it difficult. But you're right. I mean, Renard Strickland wrote an article years ago called Genocide at Law, right? And you're absolutely right. It was all done under the color of law. So the Indian removal was a lawful law passed by Congress, right? Termination was a lawful order issued by the Congress. And yet these were egregious, devastating, heinous laws that caused Native peoples countless problems. And so when the law is stronger than the concept of justice, a democracy has a problem, right? Justice should be what democracy is about, right? The law should help us to get to justice, but it doesn't always work that way. And until it does, people of color are going to continue to struggle in this country. Yeah. Back here and then over here.
Thank you so much, well, for this extraordinary piece of history laid out for us, and so much for us to complete in the future. But a question that I have for you deals with land rights, particularly I'm thinking of the Navajo and the rights to the minerals in the land. That is anything being done these days to address inequities in terms of many years, decades old laws that restricted the amount of money that tribal communities would receive? I'm thinking of Peabody Coal on the Navajo Reservation, where the Navajos even have to buy coal.
Right.
But the extraction of coal and minerals has been a real scandal in terms of being allowed, even in the Black Hills, foreign governments to come in, foreign companies to come in and extract minerals and gold with very little recompense for the Native people. What is happening there? It seems like you just find out for some sort of
This is where I think Paul's scholarship is more on point than that. But I mean, environmental justice has been an ongoing huge problem. And I taught at Navajo. I was married into the Navajo Nation for 28 years, and so I got to know their political system and their problems with the 3 states that their lands extend into quite well. And it continues to be a problem. Ezra Rosser has just published a book about the Navajo Nation, and a lot of it, he's focusing a lot on the economic issues that the Navajo Nation continues to front. It was just published recently by Cambridge, I think. That'd be a good book for you to check out. The laws are slowly being changed, and Native self-determination has improved dramatically since the 1970s, but we still have a long ways to go. Many of the leasing laws are still intact. Many of the uranium leases are still intact, and we haven't been able to find a way to get that power returned to us. And until we do, we're not going to have any environmental justice. But improvements have been made, and Biden has already done several things to make that process better. Deb Haaland, as Secretary of Interior, is working to rectify some of these injustices. But we still have a long ways to go. Paul, you want to add anything to that?
Well, maybe, as you mentioned, a lot of the laws come from the 1860s and 1870s, American books. Yeah, this is a problem because some of these native nations depend on those revenues. So there are political divisions that they
Right, yeah. And then you have tribes that are pitted against other tribes, right? Like the Crow Nation it still draws most of its revenue from coal extraction and exportation, right? And they wanted to extract some coal and ship it out through Lumbee land in Washington State. And the Lumbee said, no, you're not going to use our ports to transport coal, right? We're not going to allow that. So it pits native nations against other native nations sometimes, right? Same thing with who's going to host radioactive waste, right? Some tribes are willing to do that. Other tribes say, are you out of your mind? What are you talking about? And so we have these battles within our own nation, within our own communities, over what to do about these resources, especially ones that are so toxic. And we're still struggling with how to deal with that internally within ourselves, much less intergovernmentally. Yeah.
Yeah, so this event was shared to me because I was in a reading session. We read a boarding school session for a child. So I'm just curious about, you mentioned Carlisle, which we talked about a bit in this session. So I was wondering if you could speak to the legacy or the effects of boarding schools, because it's kind of like a 50-year period that we seem to have forgotten.
Yeah, the boarding schools, I'm no expert on boarding schools. I've read Brenda's book. Chanina Loma-Wyman wrote a great book about the boarding school her father attended, Chilocco in Oklahoma. But they were devastating. They produced students, if they survived the boarding school experience and made it back home to the reservation, many of them no longer spoke the language. They never quite fit in, and yet some of them formed organizations called Return Student Associations, and they tried to be the ones to improve the conditions for their communities, right? But they weren't always accepted by the more traditional elements of the tribe. So it created schisms and factions within communities, and it made it difficult for them. And of course, there's a legacy of some of the historic trauma associated with those moments that still is evidenced in Indian country. At Hampton, my wife and I went down there last year sometime. There is a small cemetery there that is a burial place for a number of Native children who died there, having been shipped up there from the penal institutions down in Florida. We saw little Apache markers, Papago, and a number of tribes. And not many people know about that boarding school in Hampton, Virginia. And yet there are a number of Native kids buried there. I mean, the residential schools in Canada are under fire right now. The Pope finally just issued a grand apology after decades of complaints by Native peoples. And we'll see if that apology has any real substance, right? Whether that's going to translate into any resources to help Natives find where their children are buried at many of these unmarked graves, so they can be returned home for proper reinterment. So it just created an absolute crazy mess of affairs, and we still have a long ways to go in dealing with the consequences of the boarding school era. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering whether there's more, I guess, like with Deb Haaland, you were mentioning a lot, and I'm sure you statements. You find more like sovereignty in seeing like our people kind of succeed in like these higher positions in the government, or whether you think it's more sovereign to just like kind of crawl back into our own spaces and like figure it out then, because I'm kind of conflicted because my mom like loves to see Natives succeed. Whereas my dad, like, doesn't even vote in tribal elections.
Right.
We have like a president, and he's like, no, it's like the white man. Like, so if you want to give you our own stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and you find many families and many reservation communities split. There's some that really believe that we have to engage intergovernmentally with the county governments, with the municipal government, with the states, and with the federal government. And we can do that by getting elected to positions of power or getting appointed to positions of power. But you're right, many other natives want to turn inward and focus on just trying to rebuild and resuscitate their languages, build back their land bases, and so on. I think any country is big enough to be able to handle both of those. I think we need to do both of those. And of course, there are those that say we're never going to find justice going through the American court system or the American Congress or the U.S. president, which is why we've got to go international, right? So the United Nations and the host of institutions and organs that have been developed, ultimately culminating in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which provides some recognition of indigenous rights, even though it doesn't have the standing of an international treaty. So I go back and forth on that, right? I don't vote in state or federal elections and haven't since I was 18 years old. But I will vote in my own tribal elections, although I'm not consistent there, because I see my own tribe beginning to move in a direction that's more in keeping with sort of the corporate-minded tribes. And I'm not happy with that. As I mentioned in the class today, when I learned that my own tribe had kicked out 500 of my relatives for some crazy reasons, I raised hell about that, all right? And Shelley and I gave a presentation, and we said, you better change these enrollment policies because you don't have the power to deny Lumbee identity to another Lumbee. You don't have that authority, right? And so I get frustrated by some of the decisions that Native leaders make, but I believe and I respect my friends and relatives who choose to vote or run for office in a local government. I wouldn't do that myself. But, I respect that because we need people operating at all levels of governance, right? Internal, local, intergovernmental, and international as well. It's going to take a collective effort across all these layers of governance to try and improve our situation. Yeah.